And for many athletes who have torn their ACL, there is the nervous system that we have to incorporate into the return to play process.
Hi, guys. Welcome to the Strong Female Athlete Podcast. Just want to give a quick shout out to our official sponsor, Simply Faster, a company dedicated to better tools and better technology for athlete development. If you're serious about gaining speed and power, I highly recommend you check out their amazing products and technology that's really taking athletes and coaches to the next level. So be sure to check them out, and let's get into today's guest. Emily, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's always awesome having you on. And I think this is going to be such a great topic today for our listeners because we are going to talk about the mental side of ACL injuries, whether you have torn one and you're returning to play, or maybe you haven't torn your ACL yet and you've been really healthy, but you still have that fear in the back of your mind because of things you've heard from your coach or some fear mongering on the internet in terms of female athletes and ACL injuries. We're going to talk about how we can actually shift our mindset and feel empowered and not have this fear around injury. Now, Emily, I know you grew up in the same time I did when we were playing youth soccer, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, but we didn't really talk about ACLs in a way that was so fearful and so doomsday, especially for girls. Like, girls are 6 times more likely to tear their ACL. We were aware of it, but I
Yeah.
think we were more aware of it when we were teenagers, a little bit older. But now you hear really young girls so worried about tearing their ACL, or adults are telling them that they need to be careful. And I just don't think this is good. And that's why I wanted to bring you on, because you can discuss the mental repercussions to all this and how that affects performance. But when you were
Mhm.
growing up, what was it like for you?
I have to chuckle because I if I'm thinking back and I'm giving you an honest answer, I don't think I even knew that the ACL was a thing until I got to college. I'll be really honest with you. Like, I don't think I knew a single person that tore their ACL until I got to college. I don't. And we certainly weren't talking about it, right? And certainly not in the sense of like the fear. And, I think there's been a little bit, and like, I think you can speak to this as well. Like, some of this is like, well, was it that we we just weren't tearing our ACLs as much, right? Um, what has changed. You speak a lot on just terms of how sport season, the system of sport has changed and how that's impacted the load on youth athletes. Like, I don't really know, but I can tell you, like, we were not talking about it. It wasn't a thing. And I really don't think I knew anyone that tore an ACL until I got to college. I really don't.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think you're right with that people weren't just talking about it so much because social media wasn't a thing. You didn't
True.
see all these big headlines and sound bites everywhere. I will say I did know a few girls that had torn their ACL, but they were older than 16 years old. We had a few girls on our college team tear their ACL, but even then I wasn't so scared about it. I was just,
Hmm.
you know what, focus on my own game, get in the gym, become faster, become more robust. And it was more like performance was the focus. And then as a nice byproduct, I stayed healthy. I didn't sign up for a strength and conditioning plan because I wanted to prevent injury. I just did a strength and conditioning plan because I wanted to get better at
Hmm.
soccer. And
Hmm.
then I just stayed healthy as a result. So I really want to dive into the mental side though, because I think when girls read these headlines or they get scared with things they see on social media, or maybe their teammates are tearing ACLs, I really want to empower them with some mental tools to just not focus so much on the fear around it. So maybe
Hmm.
let's start there for girls who haven't gotten injured yet, but they're scared about the ACL tear in young
Hmm.
female athletes.
Yeah, I think language is so important, right? Like, language, the words we're using, um, very much drive like how we make meaning of things. And so I really am not a huge fan of like a lot of like fear mongering, like really words like crisis and because I just think in my opinion, this is my opinion, I think they just add fuel to the fire, right? Like I'm going to give you an example here because I was thinking about this last night, right? Like let's take carbs and bread, right? Like, wasn't this a thing, where, people started coming out and talking about like how bad carbs and bread were, right? How terrible they are for, health and well-being. And I have to be honest, like, that really like using that language right without nuance and understanding like really starts to drive how people then relate to and come to eating bread, right? And so that may be just kind of like one example, but like I think language really matters, right? So when we are, scrolling through social media and there's news article, oh my gosh, news articles coming out, et cetera, right? And there's like really polarizing, again, like fear mongering language. I'm just not a fan of that because I think it adds fuel to the fire, right? So one of the things that I think we need to do a better job of is understanding that fear and anxiety are pretty complex. And at the same time, one of the things that I always remind my athletes about is that we don't necessarily need to make the fear or the anxiety completely go away, right? In many ways, what we actually need to be doing is building our athletes' capacity to handle that anxiety and that fear and to understand that there is uncertainty in life. There's uncertainty in everything, right? So one is I really like to do a lot of psychoeducation around anxiety and fear, right? Because when athletes understand what's actually happening when that fear or that anxiety arises, they are more likely to kind of connect the dots together and then develop tools and skills to actually work with that, right? Work with the stress response. Okay. So that's one, right? There needs to be just more kind of like good, and it can be like basic psychoeducation around like what's actually happening when I start to have these thoughts and I get really anxious or nervous or even into fear, right? Around tearing my ACL. The second piece is that, I really like to help athletes think in more of what we call dialectical thinking, right? Which is like both and moving away from like very like black and white thinking of either it's kind of like all or nothing, right? Mentality. And so really making space for what is true, which is that, maybe as a female athlete, I am more susceptible or more likely something makes me, more likely to tear my ACL. And at the same time, I am equipped to do everything that I need to take care of my body, to address the strength and conditioning component, right? So that I'm healthy, I'm strong, right? To really like think about the scheduling and the load on my body, right? Nutrition plays a role in this, sleep plays a role in this, right? So like again, it comes down to like those controllables, right? And I think that can be really helpful, right? Like coming back to this piece around like, well, what's actually in my control, right? And then the last piece is helping athletes sometimes tap into the fact that the fear and the anxiety around tearing their ACL might be bigger than just the actual tearing their ACL. And here's what I mean by that, right? Is like, I think you know this better than anyone who's worked with youth athletes for a very long time. Like, sport is so much bigger than an athlete just going out and playing soccer, right? It's a form of social connection and friendship, right? So if an athlete tears their ACL, there's potential for that to go away, right? Sport for many kids is a way that they connect back to their family dynamic and their parents, right? I mean, many athletes, I'm sure you know this, right? Many athletes, like sport and performance is actually the only way that they get feedback from their parents or they get interaction with their parents, right? That's a very real thing for many athletes, right? There are many athletes right now that are feeling like the only way that they can get to college or that they can get school paid for, right? Or that they have a future is through sport, right? So if they tear their ACL, that's jeopardized, right? So really helping athletes, helping parents, helping coaches understand that like there's a lot of times some deeper, more complex pieces around this fear, right? And then what that enables us to do is like work with those, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a really great perspective. And I like that you said that a little bit of that anxiety can be a good thing and athletes can use it to really equip themselves to perform in their sport, handle high loads. And I think like with the ACL, it's just more that like giving girls the tools to be empowered and
Hmm.
to train to become strong and like the reality part of it too and just recognizing, look, sports are rough. Like you
Right.
can get injured at any moment. Like that's just the reality of it, but two things can be true and you can also prepare for that and do the best you can to step on that field with that confidence and not being so fearful and letting it cripple you that you're so afraid of injury.
Yeah, right. And so the only way, right, that we get there is by actually building our capacity to be anxious, right? Like, anxiety is not comfortable. It doesn't feel good, right? And there can be, if it's chronic and very pervasive, it can have, I mean, massive impacts on our life. The reality is like it's a part of the human experience. It's a part of the athlete experience, right? And so if we don't ever like kind of like build our capacity to experience it, like we're not helping ourselves out either, right? We're not building that athlete's resilience. And so then you're exactly right. It becomes about tools and skills to help us do that, right? A lot of what I teach athletes, and I always am so clear about this, right, is that because I think in many ways, like we've become a mental health and kind of like a wellness kind of culture that is like coping skills, coping skills, coping skills, self-care, self-care, self-care. And like the reality is like those serve a purpose. There's a time and a place, but like coping skills, distress tolerance skills, self-care, those don't solve the root problem, right? They help us be in our experience. They help us tolerate, right? The experience of anxiety, which again is needed, right? But what I find happening right now with a lot of athletes is that that's not clear. That message is not clear. And so they are they get anxious, right? Maybe they start kind of going down the spiral, the rabbit hole, right? Of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to tear my ACL. I'm worried about that, right? And then they're just kind of like using coping skills, one very randomly, but also thinking that, the breathing techniques or like the grounding or the self-care is going to get rid of that fear. And I'm sitting here thinking like, it's not. It doesn't work like that, right? Those tools and those skills allow you as a human being, right, to kind of be in that fear, to see it, to acknowledge it, to learn to actually befriend it, right? So that you can continue to show up to sport and do all the things, right? Do strength and conditioning, nutrition, sleep, all that stuff, the stuff that's in our control, right? And continue to go through life. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I'm really glad you brought up coping skills because it is a form of escapism. And like you
Oh, it
said,
can be, yeah.
yeah, it's not solving the root of the problem. And I don't know if you've seen this or heard this in your experience working in this space, but I have heard some girls, they'll be so afraid of the injury, they'll be skeptical or hesitant on the field, or they won't go into tackles, or maybe if it's a really rough game, they'll ask for a sub because they're afraid that they're going to blow out their knee because the other team's
Mm,
being super aggressive. And that's really running away from the root of the problem. And maybe they're not confident in their bodies to handle that. And it's just sad that a girl's wanting to escape from a sport she loves because she's scared of that injury happening.
mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you've seen that too, but I've definitely heard that a few times.
Yeah, for sure, right? And even I think it's become more of a thing for players to like and I want to be really clear, right? Like I'm not saying that we shouldn't manage our load, right? But like even and I know you and I have had conversations about technology, right? Like even using the technology, right, to some degree can feed kind of like the overthinking and the kind of like fear-driven mentality, right? Of like, oh my gosh. And this gets into a skill that we're going to talk about very shortly in terms of like navigating the return to play process, but like this all comes down to the skill of what we call interoception, right? So this ability to really, and I think interoception is like this should be prioritizing every other skill. It's really this kind of like it's all about like the relationship that we have with our body, this sense of being able to feel, right, what's happening and what's going on with the body, right? And it really plays off of both exteroception and proprioception, right, which is like all part of being able to step into more trust and confidence and like a sense of groundedness in your own body, right? And that is, in my opinion, and with many of the female athletes that I have worked with that have torn their ACL, is a real challenge. And I think that is because we don't prioritize that, particularly for girls at a young age. And so then what starts happening, right, is we get into these kind of like sport environments, right? And even the technology can play into it here, right? But like girls don't know how to actually trust their body, right? And trust that they know what's best for their body, right? And to really kind of like um understand like the nuances of, am I just sore, or is there actually something wrong here, or is this just like uncomfortable and a pain level of like a 3 out of 10, which is totally fine in so many cases, right? Or is this harmful and dangerous, right? Like that line is really skewed. And so, yes, right. I have totally seen this where athletes are absolutely, they're taking themselves out. They're saying, you know, I can't do this because I'm going to get hurt. And again, I don't think we get to tell anybody, right, else, because like we're not inside their body. But what we do need to do is really empower, right? I love that word, and really start to teach these kind of like foundational skills that allow female athletes in particular to really be in their body and trust their body. Does that make sense?
Hey guys, just want to take a quick moment to shout out our sponsor, Simply Faster, and one of my favorite speed timing systems from them, the Freelap. I use it for my own sprint training as well as for my athletes, and they love it. It's super easy to set up, you can take it to the field on your own, and you can get accurate speed times to track your progress. Check the Freelap link in the caption below to start adding timing into your speed sessions. If you know me, you know I love my Freelap. If you're serious about speed, it's time to start timing. Oh yeah, I've seen that a lot with the pain when they're kind of feeling like a dull pain, maybe in the kneecap. That's usually very common, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, like sound the alarm! It's an emergency!" And I'm like, "It's fine, it's okay."
Mm-hmm.
But usually with those cases, I'm just like, "Look, get imaging for your peace of mind, and then move on
Mm-hmm.
with your life," because usually like a 3 out of 10 pain when you can still run, you can do high impact activities.
Mm-hmm.
You should be good to go. And I think girls are just they're not in tune with how they like really feel.
Yeah.
And I've seen that in the gym too, and I've seen that a lot recently where I'll have girls come in for their assessments and we get a baseline deadlift number to see how heavy they can go and where they can start. And I tell a lot of them, look, a lot of you are going to lift well over 100 pounds today. And they look at me like I'm nuts. And then they easily get it with good form. And
Mm-hmm.
they underestimate themselves in the gym too and what they're even capable of because they
Yeah.
have that mental barrier. Oh, I've never done this before. I've never kind of had this discomfort and I need to kind of like explore that. So it's
Mm-hmm.
so interesting.
Yeah. Well, and in many ways, like it makes sense, right? So like I'm a social worker, so I'm always going to come to a lot of this from like there's a lot of like macro level stuff happening in our society, in the various cultures that we're in within sport culture, right? That like I mean, we have kind of like a world that keeps us very disconnected from our bodies, right? And I don't think social media helps, right? And so it does actually make a lot of sense, right? And then you've got sport culture, which for a really long time, right, it kind of sends a similar message, which is like totally at all costs override whatever discomfort, pain, right? It's like that no pain, no gain, right? And so then, right, it's almost like a whiplash of like we had a lot of athletes that were like never actually listening to their bodies to the point where I mean, I have worked with clients that like even down to basic things of like being able to understand their own hunger cues and their own needing to go to the bathroom cues, right, are so skewed, right? Because they're coming from, that culture that is basically like, override everything that's happening in your body, right? And we also have a culture that really like prioritizes the brain and intellect, right? So it makes sense, which is even more of a reason, right, why we need to really be teaching this stuff and helping especially our female athletes with that skill.
Now, there are a lot of parents listening, and is there any advice you would give parents surrounding the language with ACLs? I mean, I've heard some crazy things like dads saying to their daughters, "Well, you have menstrual cycle. You're more likely to tear your ACL." And it's just like, I don't know if saying that's helping your daughter or really equipping her with the tools to reduce her injury risk. So, what can parents do?
Yeah, well, don't say that. I mean, again, it's like periods, menstrual cycles, hormones, they're not going away, right? So I think we have to shift the language to that empowerment piece, right? And so how do we slowly start to turn the conversation into what can we do? What helps you feel strong, right? Well, and I know so much of this it's much bigger than just strength, right? But like what are the habits and the routines that we can implement and we can introduce, right? That help you one, build that trust within your body, right? And that ability to kind of really start to have that like very deep relationship and knowing of your body, so that you can also feel good in your body, because body image obviously plays a part in this as well. And then two, right? The routines, the skills, the habits, along with like what's actually going to set you up to be a successful athlete, right? And so, parents, you're gonna have to, obviously depending what kind of athlete you have, what sport, all that, like you can kind of tailor those things, but like really starting to shift the language. And I think even at times it's okay to acknowledge, right, that the fear is there, right? And just kind of say like, look, I get it, right? I get that this is scary. And especially I've seen this with athletes and teams and parents where they're already on a team where multiple ACLs have occurred, right? Because the reality is that can be very rattling, right? So like it's okay, it's totally okay, and in many ways it's helpful, right, to kind of say like, I get it, right? This makes a lot of sense. This is scary, right? Like the ACL journey is really hard. And I think the other thing, sorry, I might be skipping ahead, but like the other thing that is really interesting to me, and this is why I'm really passionate about it, because I've torn an ACL and I've worked with so many players who have torn their ACL, is like it is a it is a grueling injury, right? It is really, really tough. And I think even at times, some of the language that we use to talk about, right, that return to play process can actually create fear. Does that make sense? Right? Like, oh my gosh, I don't want to go through that. I would never want to endure that. Right. And so this is why a lot of what I'm doing at the Unbroken Athlete with my business partner, right, is like, how do we get to a place where we can really understand the resiliency journey, right, through an ACL tear, so that it's not so grueling, right? It's not so scary. Does that make sense? I know I kind of went off on a tangent there, but I think that does play into the fear aspect.
I think that's a great segue because I do want to shift gears into the rehab process. And I have a handful of listeners who have reached out to me. Their daughter's in the middle of rehab right now, or she just tore her ACL. So this is going to be a valuable portion for those listening. But how do we, I guess, just help girls during this process? Because like you said, it seems like it's such a long and grueling journey, and there's so many stages and steps you have to get through, and it could seem like you have like 20 miles to run. So
Mhm.
how do we help athletes through return to play?
Yeah. So, okay, so my take and kind of where I'm drawing all this from is I've torn an ACL. I have worked as a therapist with many athletes who've torn their ACL, and through like that more coaching element. And I have a second company called The Unbroken Athlete, where my business partner is an orthopedic surgeon. And for the last several years, we have been actually conducting research on the return to play process. And the resiliency programming that we have created for them. And it's roughly kind of like 12-month program from start to finish. And what's really cool about our research is that, and we're right now using just a grit score, and compared to people who or athletes who have torn their ACL in our population, right, that has been going through our program, like our patients' grit scores are improving as opposed to um, the patients who haven't gone through a program, right? So one of the things we've really done within this programming is we've taken a really holistic approach. And I think that's super important because a lot of the talk around one, resilience, but two, just more of this like mental side of injury, I think at times fails to neglect that like your mind and your body don't operate separately, right? And so in my opinion, like it's never just a mental thing and it's never just a physical thing, right? Like the mind and the body are constantly talking to each other. And when you experience an injury, and for many athletes who have torn their ACL, um, I mean, oh, there are some athletes that I've worked with that have torn their ACL in like very traumatic ways, right? So there's even an element of trauma to this as well, right? Um, there is there is the nervous system that we have to incorporate into the return to play process. So much of our programming is around the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, which is a really foundational piece of how we, one, just like live life, but also what we call our kind of like protective systems, right? And this is what allows us to, one, stay alive and stay safe. Our nervous system is what helps shift us into a stress response, right? When we feel threat. And so what I always tell people is that like when someone tears their ACL, right, their nervous system, right, is at some point in the journey going to shift into protective states, right? Which means, right? And the only way that we can actually truly build resilience, right, is if we help the nervous system shift back. And what happens more often than not, right, is, and this is where, I mean, I do a lot in like the nervous system regulation space. This is where a lot of times we're seeing athletes get stuck, right, in that stress response in what we call nervous system dysregulation. And that has major impacts on not just the physical body and the actual recovery process, but also the mental and emotional. So some of the major components that I really have incorporated into our programming is one, this like nervous system component, right? So the nervous system is actually going to be a foundational piece of emotion regulation. So how are we helping the athlete learn how to effectively navigate and regulate emotions? And that has to do directly with interoception, right? Which is this helping the athlete develop over time this skill of really being able to come back into their body and really learn their bodily cues and learn to trust those, the feeling, the sensation. And that is also the foundation of addressing the fear of re-injury, kinesiophobia. So there's like this nervous system emotion regulation component, right? The second piece that we've within that really focused on is the grief component, because I think that's often skipped over for many athletes. Again, we talked a little bit earlier, right? Like when an athlete tears their ACL, they're losing a lot more than just sport, more often than not, right? Many athletes are losing that social connection piece. They're losing part of their identity. They're losing potentially, again, the only way that they get attention or love from their parents, right? Like there's a lot of complicated stuff in that, right? And so there's that. Then the social connection piece, which is like, you're not going to get through this by yourself, right? So how do we help you start to integrate people into this process, right? Who's your care team? Who's your support system? How are you finding really important social connection, right? This ability to kind of like be with others and understand and know that you're not alone in this. And then the last piece is skills, right? Which are what are the actual more mental and emotional skills? A lot of what we focus on is mindfulness, it's nervous system regulation, it's self-compassion, it's curiosity. I am a huge fan of what I call like flexible thinking over positive thinking. Like I'm just a huge fan of like you don't have to be positive from the time that you tear your ACL to the time that you come back. You're not going to be. Um, and you don't have to have a successful return to play, right? What you have to learn how to do is build your capacity to be in a really difficult experience, right? And that only happens if you give yourself permission at times to not be positive. I think with regards to and if you want to stop there we can, but like we can also go more into the actual like the fear of re-injury, because that's a really like interesting kind of like element as well.
I was just going to ask about that because you see a lot of people talking about how once you tear your ACL, the chance of re-injury is really high. I forget the exact percentage. Do you know?
I don't know the exact percentage, but it is very high.
Yeah, a lot of orthopedics talk about it all the time, even PTs in the rehab space. But I just think it's that fear mongering of, well, you better be careful when you go back because the chance you might get a second one, and the
Hmm.
girl's just like, oh gosh, I can't go through another year again. So
Seriously, right?
yeah, it's just not great. I mean, yes, like we can be aware of the statistics, but we don't have to put our focus on that so much.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think it's also like the further out you are from your actual kind of like return to play like clearance, right? That the chance of tearing your ACL goes or re-tearing goes down, right?
Hmm.
So that's why I think a lot of PTs really focus on that kind of like gradual introduction, right, into play. But the first thing I'll say is like this fear of re-injury is not you're not going to navigate that well if you think that it's just a mental thing. Because again, one, the experience of fear, right? Like the emotional experience of fear and anxiety is actually heavily body based because the foundation of it is really your nervous system shifting into a protective state, saying like something's not right, even if the something that's not right is just that fear of re-injury, right? Something that hasn't happened yet. And so I really think that the best way we can address this is this combination of the body, right? And the more mental side. So a lot of what I do and like my background as even like a clinical therapist is more like the nervous system, mind body connection, somatics, right? More body-based approaches. So like I think it's really interesting and very helpful to one, and we talked about this with like the um pre like habilitation piece is like one, we really need to make sure that the athlete understands what fear and what anxiety are, right? And what's actually happening in their system so that they are fully aware when that fear starts to show up, when those thoughts start to show up, when that feeling, the sensation in their body shows up, they know exactly what's going on, right? That alone can be monumental for athletes. Like that alone can almost diffuse sometimes the fear and the anxiety. So that's first, right? That kind of like psychoeducation piece. And then the second piece is actually not mental, in my opinion. It's physical, right? It's that physiological piece of building that skill of interoception to be able to go, oh yeah, this is that like increase in my heart rate and this is that like jittery feeling, right? And that's like my breath has started to like shallow out, right? And really giving them those kind of like understanding of the interoceptive cues, right, that come with that fear and that anxiety, right? Because if they don't start to learn that and have a relationship with that before they return to play, when that shows up, right, and they're on the field, right, it that's not great, right? You know what I'm saying? And it will impact people. So we have to be working on that prior to even in in our programming. Like we start talking about this and building this almost from day one, right? So that we're not just getting to like month 4 or 5 of the recovery process and going, oh yeah, here's this thing called fear of re-injury, right? Like, no, we're talking about it early, and you're building that skill of interoception, right? Very, very early in the process. The other piece that I really like to kind of like talk about is because again, I think and I saw a post the other day from someone, I don't remember who it was, right? But this like, returning from an injury and like mindset around it, right? Which is needed and helpful. But again, returning from injury and returning from an ACL is actually a heavily body-based experience, right? It is your body reintegrating back into sport. And so we really have to constantly be pairing these two things together. So what I like to do a lot of times is like actually pair uh, some type of like visualization of athletes back in their sport doing various things, but also combine that with interoceptive skills, right? So it's a lot of kind of like visualizing yourself and breaking down visualization to like very specific things, right? Like just dribbling or just making one move and a pass, right? And then returning back into, okay, what's happening in the body right here, right? Can we reground? Can we come back to the sensations? What's actually your present moment experience in your body, right? So this kind of like toggling back and forth, in my opinion, has worked really well for a lot of the athletes that I've worked with and also like a part of our programming. Rather than right just thinking that this like return to play and like feeling confident and being able to trust myself and my ability is just like a thinking or a mental thing, right? Like again, we really need that athlete to be able to feel solid and trust right their physical body, and that's not a mental or just thinking based thing.
I love this holistic approach, and I think the nervous system just deserves a huge shout out because when athletes are going through the healing process, if they're not feeling safe, then it's going to really delay healing. It's the
Yeah.
research behind this is really crazy. And I know we were like talking off air before this, but I mean, this has been going on for a while, like the work of Dr. John Sarno and then Dr. Ellen Langer from Harvard. I mean, there's so many
Mm-hmm.
people talking about this. And, it's not just injury, but it's also chronic illness if you have like symptoms. And there's just so much to it.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, like you don't have to be all happy and positive all the time, but you can have that awareness that, okay, maybe I'm not feeling as good today, but you can still like be aware with, okay, how can I take this one day at a time, or how can I use this as an opportunity to maybe hang out with my friends or do this?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm all for like, not always being positive, but just like having that realistic approach to your rehab.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's huge. I just you know me, like I love to just kind of like humanize things. And I think the more that we force that on athletes, on kids, the more it actually keeps them stuck in it, right? If we even go back to your kind of shout out to the nervous system, yeah, I mean, right? Like if and just what we know about adrenaline and cortisol and the stress response, right? Like that directly impacts the healing process, right? And inflammation and all that. So it's a really big deal. And it's why, a lot of what we do in our program is geared around that. Um, yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, I do because you mentioned earlier, I mean, a part of this is also the lifestyle component.
Mhm.
And have you ever had athletes have to kind of just revamp their whole lifestyle and how they approach things? Maybe they're in fight or flight in certain situations in life and they're never feeling safe. I mean, have you had to address things like that?
Oh yeah. I mean, here's the reality, right? And this is why a lot of like in my nervous system programming that I do with athletes, I mean, I would say most of today's athletes, especially in that more like kind of like elite setting of like high school kids that are trying to get recruited or in college kids, like they're living in their fight or flight system, right? I mean, and there's a reason for that, right? And one thing I really always like to come back to is like, again, there's a lot of things within that set athletes up to live in their fight or flight system that we can't control, right? For example, like let's talk about like the pay to play model in youth sports and just the actual like system of youth soccer, right? There's pieces of that, right, that trickle down and influence, right? This is so complex, right? And at the same time, we can be helping athletes make small adjustable changes in their day to day life. that allow them to slowly build the flexibility in their nervous system so that they are kind of shifting back and forth between that stress response and then what we call regulation, right? I mean, no one's going to live their entire lives in regulation. That's not the point, right? But what we do need to be helping athletes do is kind of build their capacity to kind of shift back and forth. And yes, this is not and it comes back to what we were talking about with coping skills. This is not like a tool, hack, or skill thing. Like this is just me, but like I'm so tired of like the tools and the hacks and the skills phenomenon, right? It's like those are important. There's a time and a place, but this is so much bigger. This is really about how you are doing life, you know? And so I have lots of conversations with athletes about this. I think sleep is probably the biggest one, and technology, social media, right?
I was going to ask you about social media. Have you had athletes say to you, okay, I need to really cut back on this. I need to stop scrolling TikTok. And did they make a change? And did they see the benefits of that?
Oh, I've had athletes completely delete it.
Oh, I love hearing that.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
especially pro athletes in during the season, because I mean, oh my gosh, like you know this better than anyone. We were talking about this, like not reading comments or like because it is, I mean, it is horrifying what some people say on social media, right? And if we don't think that that impacts our athletes, and particularly our college and youth athletes, like you are on a different island, in my opinion, right? Like I absolutely have had athletes completely delete it. They take it off their phone completely.
Hmm.
And I am such a fan of that.
Yeah, I am too, because you're right. I mean, if they're constantly getting those notifications and hate comments, they're always in fight or flight. But the truth is, they can control getting rid of those things. And
Hmm.
I don't know if you watched the Netflix documentary about the Boston Red Sox. Did you see that?
I haven't. It's on my to-do list. People
Yeah,
keep
you
telling me
should
to watch
definitely
it.
watch that. It's, gosh, Boston fans are nasty. Oh,
Terrible.
gosh.
Yeah.
And the amount of like comments and death threats some of these guys are getting
Yeah.
in their DMs, it's just insane. But now Instagram has an option where you can turn off messages from people, you can completely turn off your comments, and a lot of these pro athletes are starting to do that now because it's just too much when you are expected to perform at that level and you're having like punch after punch thrown
Oh.
at you online. Yeah, these people can't perform. They're never going to feel safe and regulated to be focused in a game and do what they need to do. So,
Hmm.
like you said, I'm all for getting off social media. I've just recently turned my comments off because I don't want to deal with the fight or flight, and I also just don't have time to respond to people. Like
Yeah.
if you really want to message me, if you care, then shoot me an email and put some thought into it. But
Yeah.
that's how you guys know where to find me. But
Yeah.
it's like just turn the comments off, turn your messages off, turn the darn notifications off. Like
Yeah. You
it's too
know,
much.
it is. And the other element of this is like the one thing that I think it's a societal thing, but social media has definitely fed it, is this like instant access to people, right? Which because and there becomes this thing of like, well, because you're on social media and you're posting, right? You should be responding to my DM right away, right? It's like this instant access that feeds that fight or flight system, right? Like I always have to be on. I personally have just set a boundary where like at 8 p.m. my phone goes on silent, right? Like do not contact me. And if you need to contact me, right, you can shoot me an email, right, and I'll get to it tomorrow morning. I just because it absolutely feeds I mean, imagine, right, like 8:30 at night somebody sends you, or like a client, right, a kid or a parent sends you a text message about like, hey, this skill isn't working, or da, 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 right, and then because we care, right, and we love our jobs, is what we do, we go, oh my God, okay, like I've got to stop everything, right? I've got to respond to this. It's not healthy. It's not healthy, right? I think the other thing that plays into this larger conversation, and then I'll put this back to you. Um, I think that the instant gratification and this kind of like perception that, and a lot of this goes along with like the coping skills and the tools and the hacks, right? I think one of the biggest problems we are facing with athletes, and this also feeds into the ACL return to play process is that many athletes think that um, they should be able to learn something, particularly mentally, emotionally, a tool, a skill, a hack, right? And they should be able to use it, and it should be able to solve and eliminate their experience right away, right? And I think that is one of the I think that's one of the biggest issues that we're facing right now because there is this, and then that just creates more frustration. It creates, the other thing I've seen is that then athletes completely abandon the tools and the skills, right? Because they're like, oh, it didn't work in 30 seconds, right? And so yeah, I mean they're feeding the cycle of like smaller bandwidth to actually be able to deal with things, you know? I think that comes up in the return to play process, right? Of like you just tore your ACL. You're not going to be playing or engaging in your sport for a while. The recovery process is long. The feelings that you have right now are not going to go away with a simple tool or hack or skill, right? And we're not doing our athletes any favor the more that we sell those things, right? What we need to be selling is, again, um, this capacity building, right? It really is like building kids' capacity to sit in the pain, the hard, the difficult, the discomfort, right? The anxiety, the fear, right? Which in turn helps them in the long run be able to navigate it more effectively.
You're so right. None of this is linear and it doesn't happen overnight, especially with
Yeah.
mental skills and things like meditation or mindfulness. I do see that too. People get frustrated. They're like, oh, I meditated for 10 minutes and I'm more anxious than I was. And I'm like, that's not the point. Like,
Yeah.
you have to stick with it. You don't have to be this like Zen Buddha sitting under a tree. Like, it's a skill you have to really practice. And I've heard you talk about this before, but like certain mindset tools aren't going to work for everyone. Like, not everyone's going to want to meditate. Not everyone's going to be a journaler. I mean,
Yeah.
there's different tools that can be a part of your own lifestyle that works for you and that you can stick with and implement consistently.
Yeah, huge fan of that. I just posted a reel about that the other day. Like, you don't have to meditate. You don't have to
Right? I
journal. You don't have
don't.
to visualize, right? Like, you don't have to. The goal is to find what are the things that help you move towards your goals. And I even am a huge advocate of like those are also going to ebb and flow. Depending on where you are in your life, where you are in your sport career, I think journaling is for me that's a great example because like I'll go through phases where like journaling is what I need, right? I need to get thoughts, emotions, things out of my body, my brain, and onto paper. And I'll also go through phases where I'm like, I'm actually wasting time forcing myself to sit down and journal when I don't have anything to journal about, right? Like some people may disagree, but I just don't think like the point isn't to um, make yourself fit into a practice. The point is to find practices that fit for you, right? And serve and support you.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this has been brilliant, and I think a lot of people listening will find it super helpful. For those of you who were inspired by the episode, please share with someone who you think will really benefit from this or who needs to hear this message in your circle. Emily's links will be in the caption below, so feel free to reach out, send her an email. Send her an email. And
Uh,
yeah, she's always open to discuss and help. And she offers a lot of services for athletes who are returning to play or who just need mental coaching. So, Emily, thank you for this conversation, and I'll see everyone next time.